Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Healthtech Pigeon podcast. I'm James, and with me today I have Jessica, and we are from the SomX team. Today we're going to be talking about Huma acquiring another company, adding another company to its roster, and what that might mean for the market. A couple of other stories if we have time, but we're thin on the ground today, just Jessica and I, so we'll see how interesting we can make it.
We'll do our best. I feel like it's been a long old week. There's been so much going on, and it's been really fun. We've seen a lot of people, had a lot of conversations, had the Sifted Summit, we had a Healthtech Pigeon meetup, the official Sifted Summit warm up, lots of friends from across Healthtech, all in one place, in a salsa dancing venue, but no salsa dancing did take place on said occasion. And I was also lucky enough actually to join a Women in VC launch event on Wednesday night, which was very, very cool as well. Kavanagh Health and some of their partners are doing some interesting things to help understand women's experiences in VC as they navigate their careers and that kind of thing, to then basically shape an initiative that hopefully helps provide some practical and tangible change, on the basis that actually if we fix things at the fund level, then actually that is going to have a knock-on effect right across the ecosystem. So yeah, it's been a week. Our social batteries are low, so forgive us for any tangential philosophical monologues that we disappear on this week. But I guess we should start with the big story that has been taking over the airwaves in Healthtech. James, what is that this week?
Huma's acquired eConsult to become an end-to-end tech platform. So it's been reported in quite a few different places. HTN said Huma acquires eConsult and launches workspace platform for health systems. It's covered in digitalhealth.net, Newsweek. It's all over the place. So they've acquired eConsult. Obviously, I've known Dan for a long time, not super well, not best friends, but I'd certainly say acquaintances at this point. I remember being on the Digital Health London Accelerator, and they were on there all that time ago, years ago. I remember seeing them get their first contract with Chelsea and Westminster way back in the day, and now they obviously turned into global corp, investment from Tencent and all this sort of stuff that's taken Dan and Huma into the stratosphere. But yeah, they've gone acquiring companies. I remember when they bought BioBeats and like a laser company back in the day, and they've
TLT.
I remember that.
I'm not going to try and pronounce that. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's a laser company. You're right.
Yeah, they did that. They've bought a few different companies, but they're almost acting like a private equity house almost at this point, like just buying companies, maybe, making efficiencies and stitching together some sort of overall healthcare company. But yeah, it's interesting, but I know you've read it. So want to give us your view?
Yeah, I think also, from our personal perspective, it's interesting because one of our very first clients at SomX actually was QDoctor, with Chris Whittle and the team. And they got acquired by eConsult a few years ago now, and became part of the eConsult family. So it's really interesting, even, from the point of view that you just shared there, having worked with Huma, which was Medopad at the time, back in the day on the Digital Health London Accelerator in one of those very first cohorts.
It's like Russian dolls, isn't it?
Yeah, having worked with QDoctor and kind of watching the industry and seeing kind of the circle of life of these companies and the whole ecosystem and how everything sort of fits together, and actually this kind of collaboration to create stronger, better solutions, I guess, for lots of the big problems that we're seeing in the headlines all the time. But yeah, I think I find Huma in and of itself is a mysterious entity. I kind of feel like I don't know if many of you have ever been to their offices, but you walk past them down in Vauxhall, and it's a bit like Batman's lair, isn't it? It's all very mysterious. What's going on in there? And we hear these stories from time to time where they make these huge partnerships, and big regulatory approvals and all of that kind of thing. And we don't often get to kind of see the action behind the doors, I guess. But yeah, looking at kind of their history, if you like, they most definitely have been on a bit of a shopping spree, I suppose, over the last few years. So this is actually their 6th acquisition, I believe. So they have acquired a platform called Amaze from AstraZeneca, which was a disease management platform for chronic diseases. They acquired Aceldis, I think is how it's pronounced, which is a decentralized clinical trials and data platform. TLT, which was continuous blood pressure monitoring, I think it was. BioBeats, as you said, mental health. iPlato, remote monitoring, hospital at home. And of course, last but most certainly not least, eConsult with its digital triage and online consultations. And when you kind of step back and look at it, that covers some pretty decent breadth. And it's really interesting that they announce it at the same time as this Huma workspace offering, which ultimately does speak broadly to the consolidation, well, not consolidation, but I guess that breadth of all of those acquisitions and a lot of the work that Huma has been doing for a really long time. And ultimately, the aim of Huma Workspace is to connect primary, community, and secondary care. We know that is a really huge challenge, not just over here in the UK and the NHS, but for other health systems around the world as well. And actually, because, health systems tend to be so siloed, figuring out how we connect all of those pieces together, both for patients and clinicians, has definitely been something that has eluded health systems countries before. So, it's exciting to see this offering. And it strikes me that, I guess as a bit of a comparison, it's like a Microsoft Office approach to creating a one-stop shop suite of systems and solutions for health systems and clinicians, clinical teams, and that kind of thing. And I suppose also when you think about from a procurement perspective, it makes things much easier where you have a suite of programs that have been put onto a procurement list as that kind of package, where people can kind of pull down from them and pick and choose what they need, much like I pick and choose whether it's Google Slides or PowerPoint, whichever is your preference, whichever flavor you prefer, Google Docs or Microsoft Word. I try not to use Excel. I have to, but you know what I mean? Like you pick and choose what you need to do the job. And I think it seems like that's what Huma is perhaps looking to do here. But again, interesting point to note is that this comes off the back of quite a recent raise. So they've raised 80 million as a Series D, a big raise for a health tech company in the UK, and not many health tech companies reach Series D even. It's not often we hear about that in the headlines. But that's also coupled with layoffs that they've recently done. So obviously decision making around resourcing and that kind of thing. One thing that struck me is that I guess interestingly, it's been a really tough economic climate. We've seen lots of companies struggling to raise. And for that reason, it was predicted that there would be a lot more of this kind of M&A activity. And Huma is one of the few that I've seen actual health tech companies that isn't a big corporate like your, General Electric or a big pharma like your GSKs or your Bayer, who are making these kinds of acquisition M&A moves. And it made me just remember that actually you can't do that unless the capital is there. So, these kinds of big health tech companies, and I say these, Huma is an example. There are a few over in the US that are perhaps making similar moves, but it seems to be kind of the main one here in the UK. They still have to have capital to be able to do that. It's not kind of just a given. And that might seem like a really obvious point, but I guess when you see these big companies picking up some of these smaller companies to build out and strengthen their offering, it's very easy to assimilate them to some of these bigger corporates, which actually they're not. They're just a bigger version of the kinds of companies that they're acquiring. But yeah, I think they're definitely doing something very different to most other players in the space. And I guess it's a story of two halves, where clearly, collecting some of this funding, but also making strategic decisions internally to extend runway, cut resource to make sure that they have suitable resourcing revenue to be able to fund these kinds of decisions and place these bets, really.
Yeah. It's quite interesting when you look at what Huma Workspace actually is. So if you go to, for anyone listening, if you go to workspace.huma.com, it's like a landing page that tells you about Huma Workspace. It's in beta currently, and the tagline for the whole thing is launched digital health solutions in days, not years. Now, when you look at this website, it starts to make sense why Huma would be acquiring certain companies, because what they have built here, it's kind of like a mixture. It's like imagine like a no-code website builder where you just sort of drag and drop and things link to different pages and that kind of thing. And it's sort of a mixture of that and something like Zapier, which is like an if this then that, which sort of links the whole thing. Now, what it talks about is building medical apps with Huma Workspace, and it lets you create medical apps with a simple drag and drop of what they call widgets, which are configured to meet your end user needs. Now, to explain this, widgets can be things like certain biomarkers or certain measurements or metrics, things like oxygen saturation, peak flow, sleeps, number of steps you do, temperature, weight, BMI, that kind of thing. It can also, you can build into your sort of clinical workflow that you're developing, questionnaires, patient reported outcomes, and you can design those questionnaires yourself, or you can pick from questionnaires that exist and those that are standardized. You can add the ability to create content, so engaging like patient content and things like that. And it's got all these integrations with health devices, plugins, that kind of thing. And it's obviously able to collect all these insights and data and then present whatever. You'd obviously release that, and then whatever people are then doing, they're reporting their outcomes, they're measuring this, that, and the other. You think you can then get, as the owner of that pathway, you then get a dashboard with everyone's graphs and all that stuff accumulated. And so they've got some essentially clinical pathways that they've got as examples on here, things like asthma, which is designed with sort of empowering individuals in mind. So patients can take control of their condition at home. So that's feeding them a lot of content based on what their results are, and it's allowing them to record their peak flow and things like that. So that's the asthma one. They've got ones for COPD, high blood pressure, oncology, myasthenia gravis, diabetes, knee surgery. So it seems that what's happening here is with the buying of eConsult, it's very clear and easy to see what happens here. The eConsult, with its triage and with QDoctor built into eConsult, so the video consultation side of things, that then starts to be built in, and that then becomes an option in these clinical workflows. And so my read on it is essentially what Huma's trying to do is to become a brand new infrastructure layer to anybody that's thinking about, on the healthcare organization side, that might be thinking about how they develop a clinical workflow that builds in exactly what they want to build in locally, and just allows those individuals to build their own clinical workflows in a very simple, easy drag and drop method. But then they also, you can also dig into the code, and it says, go beyond no code, customize with Huma SDKs. So you can also add that complexity in as well. Now, there are also other companies do that. I know people like Awell have been doing that previously as well. So obviously entering somewhat of a competitive market doing that. But with I guess more integrations, with buying more companies in. So a lot of this technology is sort of within the Huma family itself, just gives them a bit of an advantage perhaps. But it's clearly it's clearly a move to, I'm going to use the word empowering again. It's an overused word, but I'll use it again. It's empowering anybody with a view of how they want a clinical pathway to be. So therefore, it's empowering people on the ground of actual healthcare doing this every day to go on this and imagine what they want a clinical workflow to look like, with the ability to basically drag, drop, and launch it. So it's quite interesting on a number of counts.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it almost, the way I'm envisaging it is a bit like a Miro board, where you get to pull in all your different elements and you build out your workflow or your brain flow or whatever it is, and kind of select some of those ready-made, well, icons in Miro. It's clearly a lot more extensive than that here with Huma. Oh yeah, one thing that I'll be interested to see, and I guess I can make some assumptions on this, is what happens now with the eConsult brand. And I imagine, we saw something similar happen with iPlato, for example. So iPlato got acquired, comes in, and I think that the brand ultimately will end up being subsumed into the Huma family. But I think that's an interesting one in and of itself, because eConsult here in the UK certainly is well recognised, respected, certainly as a group of people, but also as a brand, having been right at the forefront of that sort of digital triage, as you said, Q-Doctor, video consultations. And so I would imagine that there is some value in that. But it's always interesting to kind of see how these acquisitions and partnerships play out over the course of sort of 12 months to 2 years, and what that looks like. But then I think also, Huma is it is a huge brand in the health tech space, that perhaps it doesn't necessarily need that additional kind of credibility from the brand perspective when they're considering some of these acquisitions. Over and above, obviously, you want strong players who have proven themselves, have trust and credibility in the space. But yeah, I guess it may not just be something that's going to be a part of the Huma story in terms of that brand, seeing that none of the others really are either. I'm interested to see what they do next. Clearly, they've just made this announcement. They'll be throwing a lot of weight behind this Huma workspace. And I guess it gives a lot more context around some potential directions that they could go in. And when you think about what's coming through now, some of the technologies, and also just some of the enduring challenges, I suppose, that we see in the health system. So I'm going to place my bets early, and I'm going to say that their next acquisition, which potentially they might have to do another raise for, so who knows when that might be, I think it's going to be around some ambient scribe, some kind of generative AI admin automation function. I know they're already doing some things in the generative AI space, and they've been exploring with Google Cloud and like MedPalm, for example, how they can make best use of that. And I haven't necessarily seen any conclusion to that yet, and I wouldn't have expected to. I think it's still such new technology, and particularly from a regulatory perspective, how that plays out in practice and how that gets deployed is still yet to be seen. But I would imagine that Huma will be one of the first movers in this space. And I do also think that there are quite a lot of ambient scribe companies out there at the moment, lots doing some really, really interesting things, and I think paving the way for how these technologies can be used safely in a clinical setting and by doctors. I think we're behind the US from that perspective. But ultimately, it's very evident that it's a huge challenge that needs to be solved, where there's just so much admin that is unnecessary. But it's figuring out what's appropriate for these kinds of technologies to do and what isn't appropriate right now as it stands in the regulatory context that we have, knowing that obviously, regulators are trying to move to be more inclusive and embrace generative AI and other technologies like it, but it's obviously not quite that cut and dry as just that looks cool, let's give it a shot. So yeah, I'm placing my bets on that, some kind of ambient scribe and admin automation,
which would make a lot of sense. Yeah, it would make a lot of sense, as you say. I think it's that is just the next frontier that we're approaching, isn't it? It's funny reading all of this and thinking back to when I was at medical school, and it sort of shows how far we've come in health tech, actually. And I guess it feels like we've reached almost like a new baseline of, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Especially when we're innovating. Entrepreneurs are always then, before Zapier exists, you're in the back end and APIs, and you try and do all that stuff yourself. And then Zapier comes out, and now all of a sudden people can no code things into existence. Same with websites and platforms like, the Wix platforms of the world and things like that. All of a sudden now it's a new baseline of so many more people can now just put up a website and things like that. It's funny when I think back to medical school, because I can remember when I was in fourth year of medical school, was it fourth or fifth year of medical school? Me and my friend Matt we just ended up chatting about diabetic patients. We're doing endocrinology, and we're seeing a lot of diabetic patients, and we saw that one of the problems seemed to be, at the time anyway, of the people that we saw in the demographic that we saw in Nottingham, was around education. And we said, wouldn't it be great, and we discussed this with our clinical supervisor at the time, wouldn't it be great if you could build something that the patient would type in their HbA1c, would type in their BMs, it would take a view on where they were, and it would feed them appropriate information for them in content. Not that we called it content at the time. I don't think that word was very well, very much out there at the time, but wouldn't it be great if you could feed people educational materials that was tailored to sort of where they were on their journey of HbA1c and blood glucose and things like that. Now, it's funny because when you scroll down this workspace.huma.com website, one of the sections is called Accelerate Time to Launch with Huma Intelligence. And they've called that HI, obviously. And for anyone that's used Zapier recently or something like that, you can type into Zapier now, build me something that links this with this and does this. And then their generative AI will then basically give you a draft. Huma has done exactly the same thing. It's exactly like the Zapier one, as it's shown on here. By the way, it's not out and will still be in beta when it does come out. So I'm not saying anything about how good it is or if it works or not, but please describe the application you want to generate. And the example that they've picked here is build an application for type 2 diabetes that takes into account patient-reported outcomes and feeds them content. That's basically the same as that idea that I had at medical school with Matt. You can literally type a sentence in here and it will just do the whole thing and generate it immediately. So that's just a really interesting full circle moment for me, I guess, that when we thought about it back then, we thought about, how would you do it? And we had to plot it out, and it was called Diabetit at the time as well, which I thought was quite interesting. Because I actually saw that on a comedy show, Parks and Recreation, the other day. They literally called something Diabetit for diabetes, which was funny. But yeah, it was called Diabetit, and it had a blue circle as a logo because that was to do with diabetes at the time. But yeah, you can now create Diabetit in a single sentence in about 5 seconds once this comes out. I'm sure other things will follow it. But yeah, really interesting moment for how far we've come in health tech to see that.
That really is something. The worlds of Parks and Recreation, James at med school, and health tech all colliding.
All colliding.
A sight to behold. One thing I want to talk about as well is, I guess, the M&A market, but just what's been going on in that space. And I think I mentioned earlier that against the backdrop of there being quite limited funding available on the table. Certainly I'm talking from a health tech perspective. I think biotech is slightly different, but limited funding available and companies struggling to raise, extending runways, that it was predicted that the M&A market was going to be quite hot for this year. And I was having a nosy around this morning, and I couldn't really find that many deals that came up, certainly not here in the UK. I think it's been hotter over in the US, and I think it seems to be kind of more commonplace over there in general anyway. But that prediction doesn't seem to have kind of come to fruition yet. And that does surprise me a little bit, because I would have thought that it would perhaps be more of a buyer's market. And it caused me to reflect on that a bit. And it comes back to the earlier point I made, which is that when you have a company like Huma, which ultimately is a scale up in and of itself, still reliant on venture backing, that capital does have to still be there. It's not that there's, untapped cash reserves waiting to be deployed. Money has to be raised for that purpose. And then when you think about the usual candidates, or I guess the usual acquirers who we would see making these moves, it's the bigger corporates, it's enterprise, it's pharma. And I think even there, when you look at in those spaces, whilst I'm sure they are sat on huge amounts of reserves, I think firstly the risk appetite isn't there, because the economic climate has been this unknown quantity in terms of how long is this going to last, what's going to change and when, what's going to be impacted the most, and really knowing where to place bets, which is really obviously reflective of the funding market. I think also, those companies as well, we've seen redundancies, we've seen programs being cut. So there's been pretty tough commercial decisions that have happened right across the board, which just because we're seeing purse strings being tightened in one place, actually that's happened right across the playing field. And just because it is potentially a buyer's market, it hasn't actually enticed people in the way that I think lots of people, including myself, would have expected some of these organizations to sort of come in and hoover up companies that were perhaps quite early on in their journey, but ultimately and sadly floundering because they're not being able to access even, that seed capital, that Series A capital, and kind of being able to get past that, where, as I said, we know it's just been so hard to access that capital, and the requirements on startups to actually be able to access it has just been pretty unprecedented. I haven't used that word for a while. Feels like a COVID term. Unprecedented. Throwback.
Yeah. So I guess for people listening that might not have a financial background or know much about like even the term M&A, like and by the way, not saying that I do either. And this is really at the edge of what I know or feel at all qualified to talk about. But mergers and acquisitions, right? So the notion that when everyone's not doing great company-wise, people are going to look to make an exit. Those founders are going to look to make an exit because they can't grow their companies because it's a bear market and everything's pointing downwards rather than upwards. And so people look for sales. That's why the bigger companies might take a look at those and say, well, they've got good assets, they've got a good technology, they've got a good patent, they've got a good team, they've got a good something, and actually we will now buy that whole thing. Obviously in a bear market that you're going to get that cheaper. And so that's essentially what you're saying there, Jess, which is that this year was touted as a time where company prices were going to look good for the bigger companies and people were going to hoover them up. And as Huma has been doing with 6 acquisitions, when you do hoover things up and stitch them together, you can have a far more compelling either offer, an end-to-end offer, or you can stitch things together and make savings and therefore make more profit and things like that. So I guess that was what was touted for this year. But I don't know, like I was thinking about this and I don't know who you would look to in the UK as being motivated to actually buy everything and stitch it together. Like who is the sort of big organization that knows and understands that whole chain and then can sell what that amalgamation of companies is creating, and who do you sell it to? In the UK, that's really difficult to know and understand. It's much easier to appreciate that in the US, which is why I think Huma is actually really uniquely placed. They probably have the most money, the most motivation, and the most understanding of sitting in the middle of early stage health tech companies, the healthcare organizations that need the value from the early stage health tech companies. And that's where kind of Huma Workspace has emerged out of, which you'd imagine is an understanding of, hey, we keep getting asked the question, can you design clinical workflows for us? And can you just simplify it? We don't want to buy 24 different startups and stitch them together ourselves. Can you guys just do that and solve a problem end to end? That you can sort of see that might be where this has come from. And so I don't know who else other than Huma would be motivated and knowledgeable enough to do that, with a view of who then the end customer actually is. And then, as you say, with enough money in order to do it. I know that Induction, it's a company called Induction, they bought Zesty, and it looked like they were going to start to do something similar, although I haven't heard too much from them since. But a similar idea, and I've heard it talked about by a lot of angels in health tech as well, with the way that they're doing their investments, is they're trying to do or get a similar portfolio as the likes of Huma are actually acquiring, and you know, them at a very individual level are trying to link that stuff together and get those people partnering up and things like that. So it's certainly not an old idea. It certainly is an old idea. It's certainly not a brand new idea, this. But it's like with all ideas, it's all in the execution. And actually, I honestly, I just think the UK is so fragmented with these really separate worlds that I'm not actually sure how the whole thing stitches together. There's a good example here, you know, like Induction tried to do, or Huma are trying to do now, or a few other bits that are happening. But yeah, it doesn't seem like obvious to me. Like, whilst company prices might be great, the startups going out of business left, right, and centre, we're unproven at the top end. We're unproven at the exits. So how much value really is there? And then you talk about buyers, right? You talked about, you know, VC funding scale ups, and then the scale up goes acting like private equity and starts buying up companies, right? Well, actually, yeah, because would private equity do it? Well, no, because I don't know if they can see the wins at the end. I'm not sure that we've got good enough margins that work at that level, or anything that they would be looking for. Basically, the scale. I just don't think we have the scale in health tech to appeal at that level. But yeah, really at the edge of what I'm qualified to talk about, as I say. But I guess that's my view.
I guess from my perspective, I think Huma's strategy is a strategy. I completely hear what you're saying, that they've taken the approach to look at holistically. I hate that word, but like, look at the whole piece and look at how they can create solutions that work across that ecosystem and almost kind of end to end. I think that is a strategy. I think another strategy I would have expected to see would be actually similar types of organizations, one that maybe is bigger or, you know, commercially further along, acquiring an organization that does something similar but is earlier on its journey. I thought we would see more of that, but I also thought that we would potentially see more of these kind of, I'll be honest, pharma M&A, where it's not necessarily about creating these end-to-end solutions as we think about the health system, but it's more about end-to-end solutions as they think about, biotech is a different thing. And I think drug discovery, drug development, I see that happening much more. But I guess once they've got their products to market, there's a lot of talk about where health tech fits into that, and, you know, supporting patients directly or clinicians and looking at different health tech solutions to do that. And we see lots of, pharma initiatives, for example, to collaborate with these innovators. And I was expecting to see more of that to translate to M&A activity. But what I've observed is the opposite, where lots of those collaboration programs have shut down and there's much fewer of them. So the opportunity for pharma to connect with the health tech companies has been reduced. So that's what I'm seeing. But actually, I wonder if the predictions that we saw for this year might move out into next year, because whilst, we are by no means out of this bear market, there are some early indicators that it is getting a bit better and it is looking more positive. And we're seeing new funds being raised, for example. And I think that is obviously an early indicator of some growing confidence. People do generally seem a bit more buoyant, although also quite pragmatic. It's been a really tough year. So I wonder, as some of that capital becomes available, we're going to be at a point where there's money on the table, but we're still seeing a buyer's market from an M&A perspective. And so perhaps actually those predictions have just been pushed out a little bit. And I wonder whether we just might see a bit more of that activity. But I think it would be probably more on the side of two very similar companies, one bigger and further along, generating more revenue, acquiring a company to basically extend its capacity, perhaps acquire some of the customer base that a smaller organization might have, some of the talent, and contracts and that sort of thing. I wonder if we might see more of that as we move into 2025, 26. But I do think you're right. Huma is really unique in the way they're approaching it. And actually, there aren't that many other companies that are similar to them who would be in a position to be able to make those moves. And when you think of kind of the big enterprise companies that even operate here in the UK, they're still US companies. So, the only other thing I could perhaps think of is that, you get some interest from some of those, the Epics of the world, for example, where they're exploring additional functionality and they've identified that actually it's much easier to make an acquisition than it is for them to build that in-house. And as companies are looking more to move to the US, perhaps those relationships get brokered and those moves are made. But yeah, so much like you, I'm not an expert, but it seems like there are potential for opportunities. I just think the activity that we're expecting to see hasn't played out for this year in the way that some might have expected it to. But hopefully we can all be a bit more optimistic for next year. That's what I'm banking on. We'll see more people just feeling better. I think I mentioned at the beginning, we had our event, which was really just a meetup. It was really, really nice on Tuesday evening. As a warm up for the Sifted Summit. And it was awesome just to be surrounded by people in the space, the community. We had VCs, we had med students, everyone in between. But I think the sentiment was pretty unanimous in that everyone's looking forward to the end of the year. It's been a very quiet summer. It's very chaotic now, but actually that is hopefully symbolic of some positive moves early next year. But that actually it's been a slog this year, and a much bigger slog than people expected. I think 2023 was hard on people, and they expected to come into 2024 and it be a bit easier. But I don't really think it has been that much easier on the space, on people as individuals. So hopefully we can drag some of the optimism that we had for 2024 into 2025 and see the reality of that. Because I think people are tired, but still they're managing to kind of crack on because they still really believe in what they're doing. And, we all have to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And that's how we make a difference, I guess.
So there you have it, guys. Huma's acquiring companies. Huma Workspace, have a look at it, workspace.huma.com. Super interesting. If you want to think about how to do stuff, I'll look back and I'll say, I had that idea when I was in 4th year of medical school. This should have been me, etc. But of course, no, this is all about execution. So, congrats to them. And we'll see how this develops. If you want to have a look at that story, it's in the newsletter, healthtechpigeon.com. You can get that. Load of other stuff in there. But yeah, it's been awesome. Thanks, guys.